The Perfect Disguise. Chapter 1: The Hidden Agenda. Jackson Hale sat in his nondescript office cubicle at Dynacor, tapping his pen thoughtfully against his notepad. To his co-workers, Jackson was the quintessential good guy. He brought donuts on Fridays, remembered birthdays, and never hesitated to cover for someone who needed a favor. He was affable, dependable, and, most importantly, utterly forgettable. Exactly as he intended. He looked around the bustling open office, watching his colleagues immersed in their work. Rachel Adams, the head of finance, was at her desk, looking over quarterly reports with the quiet intensity that had made her an invaluable part of the company. She was sharp, organized, and, Jackson noted, dangerously attentive to details. He'd have to be careful with her. Today marked the beginning of a plan that had been years in the making. Jackson had watched senior executives and board members bend the rules in their favor, skimming money through backdoor deals and lavish expense accounts. They flaunted their privilege, talking about the new summer homes they'd bought, while the rest of the staff toiled away without reward. Watching these injustices year after year had ignited a fire within him, and now, he was ready to take back what he felt was rightfully his. Jackson's plan wasn't just about money. This was personal, a way to exact revenge on the corporate machine that had always chewed up and spat out people like him. He would do it skillfully, manipulating the system from within, blending into the background while dismantling Dynacor piece by piece. Jackson's eyes drifted to Laura Collins, an assistant in the IT department, sitting a few desks away. He had made a point of getting to know her over the past few months. She was clever, tech-savvy, and often overlooked by her superiors. A perfect ally. They shared occasional lunches, and Jackson had shown an interest in her work, subtly asking questions about Dynacor's network infrastructure. Laura saw him as a supportive coworker, someone who took an interest in her career. But for Jackson, every interaction was a step closer to his goal. This was just the beginning. He planned to gather key players within the company, people he could subtly manipulate to execute the smaller parts of his plan without ever realizing their role. His strategy was to stay invisible, to be a ghost that no one suspected, all while orchestrating the largest theft in Dynacor's history. The shrill ring of his office phone interrupted his thoughts. Jackson picked it up, masking his annoyance with his usual politeness. "Jackson Hale, how can I help?" "Jackson, it's Rachel," came the cool voice of the head of finance. "I need you to join me in my office to go over the last quarter's expense reports. There's a minor discrepancy I'd like a second opinion on." Jackson's heartbeat quickened ever so slightly, but he forced himself to maintain his calm. He couldn't afford to let Rachel get too close to the cracks in the system he planned to exploit. But for now, he would keep up appearances and remain the good guy. "I'll be right there," he said smoothly, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. As he hung up the phone, he allowed himself a single, fleeting moment of satisfaction. Everything was falling into place. He was already becoming the invisible puppeteer, skillfully pulling the strings. With practiced composure, Jackson walked toward Rachel's office, his expression neutral, his demeanor calm. This was the start of something he'd been planning for years, something that would change his life forever. He was ready to play the game, and he intended to win. The Perfect Disguise. Chapter 2: The Trust Factor. Jackson sat across from Rachel Adams in her glass-walled office, his face a mask of polite attentiveness. Rachel, focused as ever, scanned through the pages of a financial report. She tapped her finger on a line in the document. "Here's the discrepancy I was talking about," she said, looking up at Jackson. "It's minor, but I'd rather not let anything slip through the cracks. Do you see it?" Jackson leaned forward, his expression serious, giving Rachel the impression that he was studying the numbers carefully. In reality, he'd already spotted the issue, an error in a travel expense reimbursement. But he played his role to perfection, pointing it out after a few seconds of careful review. "Ah, here it is. It looks like a minor input error," he said, his voice laced with just the right mix of concern and reassurance. "It probably won't happen again, but I'll keep an eye on similar entries going forward." Rachel gave him a satisfied nod. "Thanks, Jackson. I knew I could count on you." She smiled, and he returned it, watching as the last bits of suspicion melted from her expression. Jackson knew that building trust was like laying the foundation of a skyscraper. It took time, patience, and precision, but the payoff was monumental. Rachel now saw him as a dependable team player, someone who would never dream of exploiting a weakness in the system. Leaving her office, Jackson decided it was time to strengthen another connection in his network. Marcus Porter, the senior accountant who handled vendor payments. Quiet, meticulous, and painfully shy, Marcus was the sort of man who would rather work overtime than socialize. Jackson had noticed this trait early on and knew Marcus would be the perfect person to manipulate, someone who might never suspect or even question his motives. Jackson approached Marcus's desk and offered a warm smile. "Hey, Marcus, you have a minute?" Marcus looked up, slightly startled. Sure, Jackson. What's up? I noticed you've been working a lot of overtime lately. Thought maybe you could use a break," Jackson said, pulling a couple of coffee vouchers from his pocket. "Here, have a coffee on me." Marcus blinked, surprised. "Oh, thanks. You didn't have to." "Nonsense," Jackson replied with an easy grin. "We're a team, right? Plus, I know how hard you work. Just wanted to say I appreciate it." Marcus mumbled a thank you, a hint of a smile softening his normally serious face. Jackson knew he'd planted the first seeds of trust, and he intended to nurture them. Little by little, he would gain Marcus's confidence, until he could access the vendor payment system unnoticed. The day ended, and Jackson left the building, his mind buzzing with anticipation. Once he reached his apartment, he poured himself a glass of wine, toasting silently to the start of his plan. Tomorrow, he would further entrench himself in the system and continue setting the stage. But tonight, he allowed himself to relax and savor the thrill of manipulation. A quiet, intoxicating power that only he controlled. The perfect disguise. Chapter 3. Discovering the Chinks. Jackson leaned back in his chair, casually tapping on his keyboard as if he were completing yet another mundane report. But in reality, he was busy taking note of every vulnerability he could find within Dynacor's financial systems. His eyes scanned the interface, pinpointing security gaps, sloppy coding, and potential blind spots in the software used to track expenses and vendor payments. Today was particularly fruitful. Jackson had confirmed a flaw in the system that, if exploited correctly, would allow him to reroute funds into unmonitored accounts without setting off any alarms. All he needed was a few adjustments to make his scheme invisible. It was both thrilling and satisfying, like solving a complex puzzle. To add to his advantage, he'd already started observing Evelyn Chan, the company's compliance officer, a woman known for her rigid dedication to protocol. Yet, he'd also noticed her tendency to rush through routine checks on certain days, a weakness Jackson could exploit. If he was careful, he could operate under her radar indefinitely. Leaving the building that evening, Jackson found himself enjoying the crisp night air with a rare sense of satisfaction. Each day brought him closer to his goal, and he was beginning to feel invincible. But he reminded himself that one wrong move could end it all. The next day, Jackson casually approached Marcus at his desk, his expression calm and friendly. "Hey, Marcus," he said, leaning in conspiratorially. "I was wondering if I could get your advice on a little side project I'm working on." Marcus looked up, his usual look of surprise crossing his face. Sure, I guess. What's it about?" "Oh, it's nothing too crazy," Jackson replied with a laugh. "I've just been dabbling in some financial modeling, trying to predict vendor expenses over time. Thought maybe you could share some insights? I know you're the go-to guy for anything related to our vendors." Flattered, Marcus nodded, oblivious to the real purpose behind Jackson's request. Over the next hour, Jackson steered the conversation, subtly learning about Dynacor's payment processes. He asked harmless questions but paid close attention to every answer, each detail adding to his understanding of how to exploit the system. By the end of their talk, Marcus seemed more at ease around Jackson, perhaps even pleased to have shared his expertise. Jackson left his desk with a small, self-satisfied smile, already calculating how he could leverage this newfound knowledge. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together beautifully. Jackson knew that in a few weeks, he'd be ready to attempt his first real test, an inconspicuous transfer to a dummy account he'd set up. It would be small enough to evade notice but significant enough to confirm that his strategy was sound. As he walked back to his cubicle, he allowed himself a brief moment of pride. He was weaving an intricate web, a tapestry of deception that no one else could see. And soon he'd be ready to pull the first thread. The perfect disguise. Chapter 4. The calculated approach. Jackson was finally ready to test the waters. After weeks of patient observation and careful manipulation, he had gathered the information he needed. Now it was time to make his first move. A small, barely noticeable withdrawal that would pass as an innocent transaction, masked by the mountain of daily payments Dynacor processed. He knew he had to play this right. One mistake could alert someone to his scheme prematurely, so he planned each detail with precision. The amount would be minuscule compared to the millions Dynacor handled daily. It would go unnoticed, especially with the right people distracted or unaware. The perfect person to help him cover his tracks was Laura Collins, the assistant in IT. Laura handled the minor details that kept the IT department running smoothly, and Jackson had invested considerable time into building her trust. She saw him as an office friend, a kind soul in a sea of corporate indifference. Jackson casually approached her desk that morning, a coffee cup in hand. "Morning, Laura. Thought you could use a little caffeine boost," he said with a warm smile, setting the cup in front of her. Laura smiled back, genuinely grateful. "Thanks, Jackson. You're a lifesaver. I was up all night trying to fix a system error that just wouldn't go away." Jackson feigned concern. "Oh no. Anything I can help with? I mean, I'm no IT expert, but maybe a fresh set of eyes." Laura laughed, shaking her head. "I appreciate it, but it's all sorted now. Just a bit of a headache, you know." Perfect, Jackson thought. He'd learned from her offhand comments that Laura occasionally had access to override settings in the system, settings that would allow him to bypass the regular security checks for specific transactions if he could convince her to enable them. He wouldn't need to directly involve her. He just needed her to think she was doing him a harmless favor. "Actually, since you're here," Jackson began, feigning hesitation, "I was wondering if you could check a few permissions on my account. I keep getting blocked out of certain functions, and I can't figure out why." "Sure," Laura replied, typing quickly. "Just let me know which functions you need." Jackson listed off a few legitimate tasks he needed access to, including one innocuous-sounding item buried in the list: vendor reconciliation records. It was precisely this access point that would allow him to execute his small transfer without triggering an alert. "All set," Laura said, hitting enter with a flourish. "You should be able to access everything now." Jackson thanked her, forcing down the thrill of his success. That afternoon, back at his desk, he made his move, disguising the transaction as a routine vendor payment. The funds were transferred to a dummy account he had set up in a different name. He checked the record, marveling at how seamlessly it blended in with the thousands of legitimate payments Dynacor processed every week. And just like that, he'd stolen his first sum of money. It wasn't much, just a fraction of what he'd eventually take. But it was a victory nonetheless. He had confirmed that his approach worked and that no one suspected a thing. The funds were his and they were invisible. He spent the rest of the day going about his tasks as usual, nodding and chatting with colleagues, acting as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. If anyone looked at him, all they would see was the dependable Jackson, the friendly face of Dynacor. No one would suspect that he had just pulled off the first stage of an elaborate scheme. By the time he left the office, Jackson was already planning his next steps. This was only the beginning. Now that he'd confirmed his method, he could raise the stakes, make larger transfers, and move closer to his ultimate goal. And if all went well, he'd be out of Dynacor with millions before anyone ever realized what he'd done. As he walked down the busy city street, his mind was racing with excitement and ambition. He was building an empire one stolen dollar at a time. And no one, not even the sharpest compliance officer, would ever see it coming. The perfect disguise. Chapter 5: The First Withdrawal. Jackson sat at his desk, watching as the payment data refreshed on his screen. He'd set up his second dummy account, this time tied to a fabricated vendor he'd registered in Dynacor's system under a name so ordinary it was practically invisible. Metro Supplies Limited blended seamlessly among the hundreds of small vendors the company used for office necessities. Today, he would initiate his first sizable withdrawal. Small enough to go unnoticed by Rachel and the rest of the finance team, but significant enough to make his risk worthwhile. As he prepared to execute the transfer, Jackson ran through his list of precautions one last time. Step 1. He'd routed the funds through several intermediary accounts, making it virtually impossible for anyone to follow the money trail back to him. Step 2. He'd used Marcus's credentials indirectly by embedding small, seemingly inconsequential tasks into Marcus's workflow that would allow him access to these transactions without raising any suspicion. Step 3. He'd run a test transfer last night to ensure that the transaction would go undetected. Everything was in place. With a click, the funds left Dynacor's account and flowed seamlessly into Metro Supplies Limited. Jackson kept a careful eye on the records, watching as his transfer blended in with the legitimate transactions. It was flawless. As Jackson leaned back, a wave of exhilaration swept through him. It was working. He had just taken his first real withdrawal, and there wasn't a single hiccup in sight. But he forced himself to keep his expression neutral. The office was busy, and his coworkers were close by. Jackson knew he had to look as if he were just another employee, quietly doing his job, maybe even a little bored. Later, on his lunch break, he ran into Laura in the break room. She looked tired, tapping away at her phone with a distracted air. "Hey, Laura." He greeted her warmly, pouring himself a coffee. "How's everything going?" Laura sighed, glancing up. "Oh, just the usual fires to put out. Nothing new." Jackson smiled sympathetically, carefully masking his satisfaction. "Hang in there. These things always seem to pile up at the worst times, don't they?" Laura nodded, grateful for his empathy. "Thanks, Jackson. I just need to get through this week. It's been a lot." They chatted for a few minutes before parting ways. As he returned to his desk, Jackson realized that keeping his connection strong was as vital as the technical details of his plan. The people around him, the ones he manipulated, were the foundation of his scheme. They saw him as an ally, a friend, someone who would never take advantage of their trust. But in reality, every interaction was carefully calculated, every conversation a piece of his larger strategy. That evening, as he reviewed his success, Jackson allowed himself a brief moment to savor the thrill of his triumph. The transaction had gone through flawlessly, just as he'd planned. With no alarms raised and no suspicion cast in his direction, he knew he could escalate his scheme gradually, each withdrawal bringing him closer to the fortune he sought. In the weeks that followed, Jackson continued his work with meticulous precision. Each withdrawal was slightly larger than the last, each carefully masked and perfectly timed to coincide with the busiest days in the finance department. The money quietly trickled into his hidden accounts, unobserved by even the sharpest eyes at Dynacor. But Jackson knew better than to let his guard down. He couldn't afford to become complacent. He had to remain invisible, the trusted employee who never made a mistake, who always stayed late if needed, who covered for others without complaint. Each day he strengthened his web, ensuring that he stayed protected from any suspicion. By now, he had amassed a significant amount, but he knew there was much more to be taken. As he locked his office door that evening, he reminded himself that the true art of manipulation was in patience, in creating an illusion so perfect that no one even suspected it existed. And he was a master at it. The perfect disguise. Chapter 6. A strategic distraction. As Jackson's withdrawals grew in size, he knew he needed a way to keep the scrutiny off Dynacor's finances. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed a pattern, so he devised a distraction that would throw everyone off his trail and redirect attention away from his carefully executed scheme. That morning, Jackson made his way to the security department, where Alan Briggs, the head of security, sat hunched over his screen, eyes fixed on a spreadsheet filled with access logs. "Morning, Alan," Jackson greeted him with a friendly nod. Alan looked up, squinting as if he were trying to remember who Jackson was. "Oh, hey, Jackson. Anything I can help you with?" Jackson gave a sheepish smile. "Actually, yes. I wanted to discuss something that's been bothering me. I noticed some unusual activity around the accounts department, and I thought it might be worth looking into." Alan's interest piqued instantly. Jackson knew that Alan was meticulous, almost paranoid about potential security threats. It was a trait Jackson intended to exploit fully. "Unusual activity, you say?" Alan straightened, his eyes narrowing. "What sort of unusual activity?" Jackson leaned closer, lowering his voice as if he were sharing a sensitive secret. "I don't have all the details, of course, but I saw one of the newer team members working on some financial records late at night a few times, long after hours. I could be wrong, but I thought it might be worth flagging just in case. I'd hate for something to slip through the cracks, you know." Alan frowned, already deep in thought. Jackson had planted the seed, and he could see Alan's wheels turning, processing every word. The head of security was notoriously strict, and Jackson knew this would be enough to divert his attention to this non-existent threat, keeping him preoccupied for weeks. "I'll look into it, Jackson. Thanks for bringing this to my attention. You never know these days, do you?" Alan said, already typing something into his keyboard. "Of course," Jackson replied with a reassuring smile. "I just want to make sure everything's running smoothly." With Alan's attention successfully diverted, Jackson could operate with a little more ease. He felt a wave of satisfaction as he returned to his desk. He'd created a convenient scapegoat, a phantom employee who would lead Alan on a wild chase, all the while allowing Jackson's own actions to remain unseen. But the distraction wasn't only for Alan. In the days that followed, Jackson dropped hints here and there, carefully suggesting that there might be some issues in other departments as well. He mentioned the fictitious security threat in passing to Evelyn Chun, the compliance officer, during a coffee break. He hinted at strange vendor transactions to Marcus, subtly planting worry in the minds of anyone who might otherwise become suspicious of his own activities. Before long, whispers of an internal threat circulated around Dynacor. As employees grew wary, glancing over their shoulders and speculating about who might be under scrutiny, Jackson's colleagues focused more on covering their own tracks than noticing anything he might be doing. In the midst of this chaos, Jackson made another move. Using Laura's access permissions, which he had obtained under the guise of fixing his access issues, he executed his next transfer, this time larger than before. The funds slipped smoothly into his network of hidden accounts, masked by layers of small, fragmented transactions routed through international channels. It was flawless. Jackson's heart raced as he logged out, feeling the thrill of success wash over him. He had not only pulled off another transfer, but he'd done it under the very noses of the security team, compliance, and finance. His manipulation had them so distracted that they were chasing shadows, leaving him free to continue his work. By now, Jackson had accumulated a small fortune, but he knew better than to grow complacent. His goal was still far from reached. There was more to take, and he planned to take every last dollar he could manage without triggering suspicion. This was a game of patience, and Jackson Hale was determined to play it until the very end. As he left the office that evening, Jackson took one last look around. The atmosphere was tense, with employees quietly speculating about the internal threat that Alan had been investigating all week. He hid a smirk. They were so consumed by their own anxieties that they wouldn't dream of suspecting the unassuming Jackson Hale. He walked out into the night, confident that he'd mastered the art of manipulation, carefully orchestrating every move from the shadows. The heist was only beginning, and he intended to walk away with everything he'd ever dreamed of. The perfect disguise. Chapter 7: Winning over the board. Jackson knew that his heist couldn't rely on lower-level distractions forever. As his scheme grew more ambitious, he needed allies in high places, people who held power within the company and could unknowingly shield him from scrutiny. His targets: Cynthia Harper and Lucas Finch, influential members of Dynacor's board. Over the past months, Jackson had made himself visible in the board members' circles. At company functions, he positioned himself nearby, catching their attention with friendly but discreet interactions. He knew that building trust with board members required subtlety and a reputation for integrity. It was a challenge he relished, a new layer in his plan. One evening, during a company-sponsored charity gala, Jackson noticed Cynthia Harper standing by the bar, nursing a glass of wine. She was a respected member of the board, known for her dedication to Dynacor's mission and her keen eye for talent. Jackson approached her casually, exuding the same friendly warmth he'd used to win over his colleagues. "Good evening, Miss Harper," he said, giving her a polite nod. "How are you enjoying the gala?" Cynthia turned to him, her initial surprise melting into a gracious smile. "Please call me Cynthia. And yes, it's been lovely. Though I must say, these events can feel a bit predictable." Jackson chuckled, nodding in agreement. "I know exactly what you mean. It's all so formal. But I think it's nice to see the company giving back. Sometimes I worry the corporate world gets too focused on the bottom line." Cynthia raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Not something I hear often from our employees. Most people are focused on climbing the ladder." Jackson shrugged modestly. "I've always believed in doing things the right way. I just want to make sure my work benefits the company and the people involved." Cynthia seemed to relax, her guarded demeanor softening. Jackson could see he was making an impression, building a foundation of trust that would be useful when he needed it most. Over the next hour, they discussed everything from company ethics to charitable projects, with Jackson carefully mirroring her values and opinions. By the end of the night, she had warmed to him considerably, seeing in Jackson a rare honesty and integrity. Over the following weeks, Jackson continued cultivating his relationship with Cynthia and began striking up similar conversations with Lucas Finch, another board member. Lucas, a former Wall Street executive, was more straightforward, and Jackson adjusted his approach accordingly. With Lucas, he presented himself as a results-driven professional with a dedication to the company's success. He carefully dropped mentions of his modest upbringing and hard work, painting a picture of loyalty and dependability that resonated with Lucas. Soon, Jackson became a fixture in their circles, a familiar and trusted presence. By the time rumors of an internal threat began circulating in the company, Cynthia and Lucas were among the first to dismiss them. They saw Jackson as an upstanding employee, someone who would never be involved in anything shady. Jackson's growing favor with the board shielded him from suspicion in more ways than one. Whenever questions arose in finance or security, a quick word of reassurance from Lucas or Cynthia would be enough to turn the conversation away from him. It was a shield he had crafted carefully, layer by layer, and it was paying off. One evening, as he sat at home reviewing his next transfer, Jackson allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. With the board members unwittingly vouching for his character, he had reached a new level of protection. He could operate with more confidence, knowing that the people at the very top of Dynacor saw him as one of their own. The next day, he initiated a new round of transfers, his largest yet. The money flowed into his network of hidden accounts, each transaction seamless and undetected. As he watched the numbers climb, Jackson felt an exhilarating sense of power. His plan was working beautifully, every piece moving as he'd designed it. He leaned back in his chair, savoring the thrill of his success. This was no ordinary heist. It was a masterstroke of manipulation, a flawless illusion that no one could see through. He was in control, and he had Dynacor's own leaders unknowingly defending his every move. But Jackson knew that each level of success demanded new levels of caution. For now, he'd play his role, the dependable employee who was trusted by the board, respected by his colleagues, and adored by everyone around him. He was the perfect disguise. The perfect disguise. Chapter 8. A close call. Jackson's plan had been progressing smoothly, with his carefully hidden transactions accumulating into a small fortune. But as with any carefully woven scheme, cracks could appear in unexpected places. One afternoon, Jackson received a message from Rachel Adams, the head of finance. She wanted to discuss an inconsistency she'd noticed in the vendor payments for the last quarter. Jackson's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. This wasn't a disaster yet. His meticulous planning had accounted for minor errors, and he had contingencies for this sort of situation. But Rachel was sharp, and even a small slip-up could lead her to the edges of his scheme. He walked to her office with an easygoing expression, reminding himself to stay cool. He knocked on her door, and Rachel waved him in, her face focused but unreadable. "Thanks for coming by, Jackson," she said. tapping her pen on the desk. I noticed something odd in the expense reports. There's a minor discrepancy with one of our vendors. Metro Supplies Limited, I believe. It's nothing major, but it raised a red flag. I'd like your thoughts on it. Jackson kept his face impassive as he took a seat, looking over the report she handed him. Metro Supplies Limited was one of his dummy vendors, an account he'd used to funnel his latest withdrawal. He designed it to blend in, but Rachel's attention to detail had still picked up on it. For a moment, he considered his options. Deny too quickly, and he'd seem defensive. Show too much curiosity, and he might seem suspicious. Jackson had become a master at playing these subtle psychological games, and he'd carefully crafted an image of himself as both competent and genuinely concerned about the company's well-being. It was time to play his part. He tilted his head slightly, furrowing his brow as he examined the report. I see what you mean. It's a bit higher than the other vendor payments for the same period. He glanced up at her, careful to show only a trace of concern. It might be an input error. I know Marcus has been under a lot of pressure lately. Maybe something slipped through the cracks? Rachel nodded, seeming to consider this. That's possible. Marcus has been covering a lot of ground lately. I'll have a word with him to make sure he double-checks these entries. Jackson relaxed slightly, relieved that she'd taken the bait. But he knew this wasn't the end of it. Rachel would be watching vendor payments more closely now, and if she found another discrepancy, it could lead her right back to him. He'd need to change tactics, introduce a new layer of misdirection. As he left Rachel's office, Jackson's mind raced with ideas. His plan was still safe, but he needed to reduce his reliance on Metro Supplies Limited and find a new route for his withdrawals. Perhaps he'd create another dummy vendor under a different department, something that wouldn't fall under Rachel's purview. Or he could temporarily pause his transactions, letting things cool down before resuming. But more importantly, he needed to keep Rachel's attention elsewhere. Over the next few days, he carefully orchestrated a subtle rumor, planting seeds of doubt among his colleagues that Marcus might be falling behind on his work. Nothing too obvious, just the occasional offhand comment about his workload or his late nights at the office. Before long, whispers spread, and people began seeing Marcus as the likely source of any financial discrepancies. Meanwhile, Jackson scaled down his withdrawals, keeping his activity to an absolute minimum. He monitored his accounts closely, watching as his funds trickled in from other sources. It wasn't the same volume, but it was enough to maintain his scheme without raising further suspicions. Jackson's patience was tested, but he held his ground, carefully balancing each move. He continued to interact with his colleagues as usual, keeping up the facade of the dependable, trustworthy Jackson. His loyalty to Dynacor was unquestionable in the eyes of those around him, and his growing favor with the board had made him nearly untouchable. But he couldn't afford another close call. He knew that Rachel was too sharp, and if her suspicions resurfaced, he'd need to adapt quickly. For now, he focused on maintaining his cover and gradually shifting his methods, ready to pivot at a moment's notice. As he returned to his desk, Jackson allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. He'd navigated the close call, deflecting attention with precision and avoiding suspicion. He was playing the game as only he could, manipulating every piece in his favor, moving one step closer to his ultimate goal. But he knew the stakes were rising. His actions, once small ripples, were now sending waves through Dynacor's tight-knit world. He was still in control, but he had to be more careful, more calculating. There was still much to gain, and much more to lose. The perfect disguise. Chapter 9. A turn of events. Jackson's operation had been running smoothly, but he knew better than to assume he was untouchable. As he continued his heist, there was one thing he hadn't counted on. The loyalty of those he'd manipulated could be as fragile as his own loyalty to Dynacor. One morning, Jackson noticed something odd. Laura Collins, his ally in IT, avoided his gaze as they passed in the hallway. Her usual friendly smile was gone, replaced by a hurried look of discomfort. Jackson felt a ripple of unease. He'd always prided himself on being able to read people, and something about her behavior wasn't right. Later that day, he intercepted Laura by the break room, casually initiating a conversation to gauge her mood. "Hey, Laura," he said with his usual warmth. "Everything okay? You seemed a bit stressed earlier." Laura hesitated, glancing around nervously. "Yeah, just busy," she replied, her voice tight. "A lot going on in IT these days." Jackson kept his expression neutral, masking his concern. "I get it. It's been hectic everywhere lately," but he could see that something was wrong. As they parted ways, Jackson realized that Laura knew something, or suspected something, that she hadn't before. It was possible she'd pieced together enough of his actions to become suspicious, or maybe she'd noticed the patterns in the requests he'd made over the months. That evening, Jackson met with Rick, his old friend and occasional partner in the scheme. He needed someone who could confirm his suspicions without drawing attention, and Rick had the skills to hack into Dynacor's employee emails without being detected. "Keep an eye on Laura Collins," Jackson said in a low voice. "Check her communications for anything unusual. If she's talked to anyone in security or compliance, I need to know." Rick nodded, but Jackson could see the curiosity in his eyes. "You think she's on to you?" "I don't know yet," Jackson replied, irritation flaring. "But I can't take chances." Days passed as Jackson waited, watching Laura from a distance, while Rick monitored her activity. Finally, Rick gave him the update. Laura hadn't contacted anyone in security, but she'd exchanged a few tense messages with Marcus, the senior accountant. The messages were vague, but it was clear she'd noticed inconsistencies in his requests. This was a problem. If Laura started talking to Marcus, and they began connecting dots, his entire scheme could unravel. He needed to act quickly, to divert attention once more and keep them in the dark. Jackson decided on a new approach. Rather than confronting Laura directly, he'd exploit her loyalty and frame it as concern for her well-being. That afternoon, he sent Laura a message, subtly acknowledging the tension he'd noticed. "Hey Laura, just wanted to check in. I feel like something's been off lately, and I'm worried about you. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help." The message was carefully crafted to seem genuine, but Jackson knew that beneath it was a carefully veiled warning. He hoped to plant the idea that any suspicion she had was unfounded, that he was just a friend, someone who cared for her as a colleague and nothing more. Laura responded later that evening with a hesitant, "Thanks, Jackson. I'm just figuring things out. Nothing to worry about." But her reply left him unsettled. He knew that she was on the verge of figuring out something major, something that could blow his cover wide open. His perfect web of manipulation was under threat, and it was a reminder that no matter how skillful he was, people were unpredictable. Jackson went home that night with a nagging sense of urgency. His plan was still intact, but he needed to take decisive action, and he couldn't afford another close call. If Laura's suspicions grew, she could easily unravel everything he'd worked so hard to build. As he poured himself a drink, Jackson took a deep breath. He'd overcome obstacles before, and he would again. He would adapt, manipulate, and control the narrative just as he always had. But this time, he would have to be more careful. His game of shadows had just grown more dangerous, and from now on, every move mattered. The perfect disguise. Chapter 10: The Final Heist. Jackson had known from the beginning that his plan couldn't go on forever. But as the money accumulated, he became more ambitious, pushing the limits of his scheme. He had set up accounts in offshore banks, hidden under layers of anonymity, ready to accept the largest transfer he had ever attempted. It would be his final heist, a multimillion-dollar extraction that would leave Dynacor reeling. In the days leading up to it, Jackson made final preparations. He kept a low profile in the office, carefully avoiding interactions with Laura and Marcus. He could feel the tension tightening around him, but he couldn't stop now. If he could pull this off, he'd vanish, leaving nothing behind but an empty cubicle and a hollow company desperately trying to piece together the remnants of his fraud. His first step was to secure a 48-hour window, during which the company's systems would be under minimal monitoring. Jackson knew that if he executed his plan on a weekend, the finance team wouldn't notice the movement until Monday. But he needed a second layer of distraction to keep anyone from noticing his absence immediately after the transfer. He decided to enlist Rick one last time. This heist needed a cover so strong it would overshadow any financial discrepancies, at least for a few days. Jackson arranged a meeting in a quiet bar, explaining his plan to Rick over drinks. "This is the last job," he told him, keeping his voice low. "I need you to create a security breach, something big enough to draw all attention to IT and away from finance. A data leak, maybe a system error, anything that looks like a real threat." Rick's eyes widened, but the promise of a hefty cut silenced his concerns. "I'll do it, but this better go off smoothly, Jackson. This is huge." Jackson nodded, gripping his drink tightly. "It will. By the time they notice the missing money, I'll be gone." On Friday evening, with the office empty, Jackson initiated the heist. Using Laura's permissions and his carefully crafted web of dummy accounts, he made the transfer. The money slipped through Dynacor systems in perfectly calculated chunks, routed through multiple vendors and international accounts before finally landing in his offshore fund. Each transaction was masked by bogus invoices and obscured by technical misdirections Rick had set up earlier that day. The transfer completed flawlessly, millions of dollars moving in silent stealth through the system. Jackson felt a surge of triumph as he watched the balance in his hidden account skyrocket. He had done it. The biggest heist of his career, executed without a hitch. The next morning, the chaos began. Rick's staged breach triggered an alarm in Dynacor systems, sending IT into a frenzy. Emails flew, and meetings were called as executives scrambled to contain the supposed leak. All eyes were on IT exactly as Jackson had planned, and Jackson was nowhere to be found. He'd left a carefully crafted resignation letter on his desk, a simple note apologizing for the abrupt departure and citing personal reasons. By the time Dynacor's finance team discovered the missing millions, Jackson would be long gone, slipping into a life far from the corporate walls he'd deceived so masterfully. As he boarded his flight that night, Jackson allowed himself a final glance at the city skyline. His heart pounded with exhilaration. He'd taken everything he wanted, and he'd left behind nothing but smoke and mirrors. But as the plane lifted off, a strange sensation settled over him. The thrill of the heist, the high he'd chased for so long, began to fade. He was free, wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, and yet, he felt a strange emptiness. Jackson forced the feeling aside, focusing instead on the future he'd secured. He had outplayed everyone, every piece had fallen into place, and he was on his way to a new life, a clean escape with millions in his pocket. But the price of freedom, he realized, was solitude, and it was a price he would have to pay. The perfect disguise. Chapter 11. Closing the curtain. Jackson had settled into a quiet, luxurious villa nestled on the coast of a secluded island, a far cry from the sterile office halls of Dynacor. The ocean stretched out before him, glittering under the midday sun. This was the life he had envisioned. Free from the monotony of a desk job, with enough wealth to never worry about anything again. For the first week, Jackson savored his newfound freedom, indulging in the opulence he had denied himself during his years at Dynacor. He spent days lounging by the private pool, nights savoring the finest wines, and mornings waking to the sound of waves rather than the sterile beeps of an alarm clock. But as the days passed, Jackson began feeling something strange, a creeping unease that wouldn't let him fully relax. He had been a ghost for years, operating in the shadows, but now he felt like a fugitive, living in a cage he had crafted himself. One evening, as he watched the sun dip below the horizon, Jackson's thoughts drifted back to Dynacor. He imagined the chaos that must have unfolded in the wake of his departure, the frantic meetings, the desperate search for answers. He had left them chasing a phantom, a trail so meticulously crafted that they would never find him. He should have felt victorious. Instead, he felt hollow. His phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. It was an encrypted message from Rick, who had played his part in the heist without question. Jackson read the message, his stomach twisting as he saw the words. "They're investigating. Someone's talking. Thought you should know." Jackson's heart pounded. He had left behind a flawless plan, an impenetrable wall of misdirection. But this was a reminder that nothing, no matter how carefully planned, was truly without risk. Paranoia began to gnaw at him. He knew Rick wouldn't betray him, not willingly. But Dynacor had resources, and if they got close enough, they might trace his movements, uncover his connections, piece together fragments of his network. And if they turned up the heat on Rick, who was prone to recklessness, they could eventually track him down. Jackson's mind raced as he considered his options. He'd have to go even deeper into hiding, disappear in a way that left no traces, maybe even change his identity entirely. The thought unsettled him, but he knew he didn't have a choice. The life he'd stolen required him to constantly look over his shoulder, to live with the constant threat of discovery. The next day, Jackson made arrangements to relocate. He liquidated a portion of his offshore accounts, converting his funds into cryptocurrencies and transferring them to untraceable wallets. He wiped his devices, removed any digital footprint, and left behind the villa that had felt like a prison from the start. He was abandoning the very life he'd sacrificed everything to build. As he boarded a chartered plane to another remote location, Jackson sat back in his seat, feeling the weight of his choices settle heavily on him. For the first time, he realized the irony of his situation. He'd sought freedom, power, and wealth, yet here he was, running from the very life he'd dreamed of, haunted by the ghosts he'd created. He looked out at the clouds, wondering if the life he'd left behind was worth it. Every lie, every betrayal, every calculated manipulation. All of it had led him to this moment, to a life of endless escape. As the plane lifted off, Jackson closed his eyes. He had succeeded in the ultimate heist, but the victory had left him with a hollow sense of emptiness. This life, this game of shadows, had become a cage he couldn't escape, and he knew that, despite his wealth, despite the power he'd gained, he was now a prisoner of his own making. The perfect disguise. Chapter 12, The Mastermind's Legacy. Jackson landed in a small coastal town, thousands of miles from Dynacor, far from the life he had once known. He had swapped identities, removed every possible trace of his past, and yet, as he stepped into his new reality, he felt an odd sense of disconnect. The thrill of his meticulously crafted plan, the adrenaline that had propelled him for years, had vanished, leaving only an emptiness that money couldn't fill. Settling into a modest but secure apartment, Jackson spent his days exploring the quiet streets, blending in with the locals. He knew he was unrecognizable here, just another foreigner in a small town. But as the weeks passed, he found himself haunted by memories of the people he had manipulated. Laura's trust, Marcus's reliability, Rachel's unwitting assistance, even Rick's loyalty. They had each played their part, unknowingly, in helping him pull off the perfect heist. And yet, the betrayal he had felt justified in now gnawed at him like an open wound. He tried to move forward, but his mind kept returning to Dynacor, to the life he'd left behind. He had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, and yet he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had lost more than he'd gained. The wealth that had once seemed so enticing now felt like a burden, a reminder of the deceit and manipulation that had taken him here. One evening, while sipping a glass of wine in the solitude of his apartment, Jackson received an unexpected message. It was from an anonymous account, but the words were unmistakable. "Enjoying the view? You've been found." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. He had been so careful, leaving no loose ends, eliminating any trail that could lead back to him. He quickly scanned his devices, checking for any signs of tracking or spyware, but everything appeared clean. Panic and paranoia crept in. Could it be Rick, a member of Dynacor, someone he had overlooked in his plan? He stared at the screen, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't stay. He'd have to move again, change everything, cut ties with anyone who might still connect him to his past. The endless cycle of evasion was beginning to wear on him, a stark contrast to the life of freedom he had envisioned. And for the first time, he questioned whether this pursuit of power and wealth had been worth the cost. The next day, Jackson began preparing for his next move, but he felt drained, his energy sapped by the weight of his secrets. No amount of wealth or luxury could erase the isolation that now enveloped him. He had become a ghost, drifting from place to place, always looking over his shoulder, never at peace. As he packed, Jackson caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. The face staring back was that of a stranger, hardened by deception, aged by betrayal. He realized, with a bitter clarity, that he had become a prisoner of his own making, trapped not by bars but by the lies and manipulation that had built his empire. And so, Jackson Hale, the mastermind, the thief who had orchestrated the perfect heist, vanished once again into the shadows, leaving behind only a legacy of deceit. He had outwitted an entire corporation, but in the end, he had outwitted himself, losing everything he had once been in his relentless pursuit of power. The game was over, and he was left with nothing but the hollow satisfaction of having played it. The end.